Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Dawn of Drones podcast. I'm Dawn Zoldi, your host and the CEO of P3 Tech Consulting. We are knee-deep in a month dedicated to industry enablers, sponsored by True Weather Solutions and presented by Grand Sky. And thank you to DroneLife again for being our gracious host for this entire year. It's been an amazing year. But we have a great show lined up for you today because we always talk about these things: command and control, beyond visual line of sight, the future of urban air mobility. And the company and the person we have here today are the folks that are going to make this happen. So this is CEO of Aura Networks, Bill Tolpegin. Did I say that right, Bill?
Tolpegin. It's a tough
Tolpegin. I'm sorry. So, I'm right. Zoldi. Everybody calls me Zoldi. I apologize. I totally get that. You think I'd get this right by now, but so great to have you on the show, Bill. Really appreciate you. By the way, everybody out there, we are absolutely live, so don't forget that. Drop your notes in the chat. Say hello. Tell us where you're from. Ask your questions, because this is a very complex area that is so critical to UAS and AAM operations both, okay? But Bill, you will stay tuned, because Bill is so great at boiling these very complex topics down in a way that's completely understandable. So I'm really excited and thankful for you to be here, Bill, to tell us all about the future of command and control and what Aura Networks is doing. So let's go ahead and start with you, Bill, before we get into Aura Networks and what you all are doing. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So 30 years in telecommunications and spectrum. Most recently, before I co-founded Aura with a bunch of industry veterans, I was at the C-band Alliance, which was a joint venture between a number of satellite companies designed to repurpose mid-band spectrum in the US for use from satellite carriers to mobile carriers. And that resulted in the C-band auction, which turned out to be actually the largest auction in US history. And we got about $10 billion for the satellite companies. For that, I started a company called OTA Broadcasting. We were a nationwide television broadcaster, but we had an eye on participating in the FCC's incentive auction, which was the first reverse and forward auction that the FCC had ever held. And that raised about $20 billion for the FCC. And that repurposed broadcast spectrum from television broadcasters to mobile carriers. And before that, I just had a lot of corporate development and finance roles in satellite companies. And I was at Earthlink for a long time, had a great opportunity there, and actually helped, was very early on at Global Star years ago, helped get that company started.
Awesome. Well, you crack me up, because you're like, oh yeah, I worked this $20 billion, $30 billion deal, So, I mean, just a foot stomp, the background expertise that Bill brings to the table, and now with Aura Networks. So let's talk about the company, what it's all about. So command and control, or what we call in the military C2. Most of us know kind of what that is, right? But can you briefly explain what it is and its critical importance to uncrewed aircraft operations and advanced air mobility operations? And Bill, I think we might have a slide that might be helpful too, as you explain this.
Okay.
Yeah, slide 1. So let's go.
Let's take a look at slide 1. All right, great. So yeah, that has some good bullets about kind of what we're doing. So first, as you mentioned, flying beyond visual line of sight is the holy grail.
Oh yeah,
and that really matters. And there's really kind of two areas that the drone market's really maturing in. One is in, I'd say, uncontrolled airspace. So that's 100, 200, 300 feet above the ground, much smaller UAS. And that's usually going to be found for like package delivery and things like that. And the other market is in controlled airspace, and that's for larger UAS, and that's more for cargo, urban air mobility, long linear inspection, and a host of other opportunities. So what Aura's focused on is building a network to support beyond visual line of sight operations in controlled airspace, right? And that's a key thing, because that also, we supply voice, and that actually integrates with air traffic control. So, Command and control has to happen for that. You have to have a command and control link that's actually regulatory compliant with something that the FAA calls DO377A, long standard. But how we do it, and you can see that the talking points here, right? We have licensed spectrum that is specifically licensed for use with both crewed and uncrewed aviation. That's a huge point. We build a network across the country. We have a network across the country right now. It's more of a test network, but we have the ability to build across the country to meet any route demands that our customers are, where their customers are interested in flying. That's where we build. And we build that to FAA standards. We do that over a private network. So we don't touch the internet. So that means it's dedicated, purpose-built for aviation, but it's also highly secure. It's robust in that it's redundant. So you have a deterministic command and control signal. And we do that both, there's a number of different elements of what we call C2, as you mentioned earlier. But data and voice really are the primary focus points for what we're doing. And voice is important for air traffic control, which we'll talk about in a moment. And because we build where customers want to fly, we're very cost effective. So you don't, we don't, build the whole country or build a market and then start advertising kind of thing. We actually focus the build on exact routes where customers want to be, because there's no point in having a route, 500 miles to the north if a customer's not going to use it. So.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, Bill, because, and we can kind of bring that slide down, just chat here. So many folks are kind of building these solutions in search of a problem. Like, clearly you're out there talking to customers, like, what do you need and when do you need it? Where, importantly, do you need it? But there's so much you just said that I really want to break down, because it's so critically important, kind of to understand what it is that you're talking about. So first of all, could you, and I want to foot stomp this, the importance of the approval that you have to use licensed spectrum for both crewed and uncrewed aircraft. Can you explain kind of the uniqueness of that approval? And it was from the FCC, right? The Federal Communications Commission.
Right. No, so that was that's exactly right. So spectrum is really the lifeblood of mobile communications. And so you don't have a lot of bands that are aviation bands, let alone UAS-enabled aviation bands.
Right.
So that without that approval, you just full stop wouldn't be able to build this network. Right. So that's kind of that's step one. And so we feel we were very fortunate to be able to work. We've partnered with the FCC on this. We actually went out and bought this spectrum, and at the same time, we're working with the FCC to get the authorizations changed around this. So, without that spectrum, you wouldn't be able to get started. And the frequency that we have this spectrum is such that it enables really great propagation. So the signal can go very far, or the signal, another way to look at it is a signal when you're up close or in our case, close is still hundreds of miles, is very robust. So it's very hard to break the signal, which again lends to the ultra reliable nature of what we're trying to do in the first place, which is make this, unbreakable link, if you will, for command and control, because it just can't break, right? So,
especially for beyond visual line of sight. I mean, there's nothing more critical about having a robust C2 link for those kind of operations. I mean, having been in the Air Force as long as I was, I mean, they're flying them from Creech, right, overseas in the Middle East, and having that C2 is critical.
Yeah, absolutely right. You have to have that, or it's a non-starter. If you don't have the spectrum, it's a non-starter.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. So you talked about kind of these components of C2, kind of the data, the voice. I want to talk a little bit about the control and non-payload communication links, or what we call CNPC,
right? To
kind of explain how this works with the C2 and how this works with AURA.
Yeah, sure. So what that means is, per this FAA standard that I mentioned earlier, DO377A, if you want to fly in controlled airspace, you have to operate according to that standard. Think of that as just kind of the rule of thumb.
And Bill, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that standard is from RTCA?
That's correct.
Okay,
that's
gotcha.
It's the RTCA. That's the standards body that it has heavy industry involvement that makes the aviation standards. And there's a number of other standards that relate to UAS, but the one I'm really going to focus on today is just 377A. And so that one has a whole bunch of characteristics that the link has to meet. Think about that from an availability, reliability, jitter, all these different kind of aspects that you have to have, right? So for command and control, it's sort of kind of a header, right? And underneath that, you have the data, you have the voice, you actually have detect and avoid. There's a number of different things that really kind of fit in there and are considered mission critical. So it's not like video streaming or anything would fit in that. It really is mission critical telemetry, right?
Gotcha.
And voice is another big thing for that, right? So that's also a requirement. And in 377A, they mention the requirement, but they also talk about things like latency. So when you step back and look at what AURA is doing, this robust private network on aviation spectrum, we also have to make it a very high performance network from the metrics that you find in 377A, right? So it's got to have super low latency for voice. And that's one of the reasons it can't touch the internet. Security is one reason, but also, of course, you really can't measure latency in any kind of consistent way over the internet because there's a lot of different hops. Who knows where you're going to be going, right? So we build this network to have a private connection from the actual pilot all the way through the network, then up to the UAS and then back, right? It's all private.
Okay, so it's from the pilot up and back down. That's kind of the connection we're talking about. And the voice aspect, is that kind of aircraft to aircraft to ATC, or air traffic control, and both?
Right. So the way the voice works, it works over our network, but it manifests itself in a very similar way to how voice is used in controlled airspace today.
Okay.
Right? So voice is used both for situational awareness as well as directly talking to ATC. So when a pilot is speaking on our network, they're actually going up to the UAS on our network, and then it broadcasts out on traditional frequencies, right? So traditional radio that is being used, that's how it's heard. So if you're a pilot in another aircraft, you're going to hear the UAS speaking. You're going to hear the pilot of the UAS speaking as if the pilot was in the aircraft, right? In that other aircraft, right?
Wow.
And that allows so good situational awareness. That also allows the pilot then, who might be in a different state. Again, remember, we're talking flying beyond visual line of sight. That allows the pilot to communicate with air traffic control real time. And so there's lots of regulations, as you can imagine, around that, right? So you have to really build your network and your build all the gear to make sure they can handle and meet those type regulations.
All right, awesome. And great question here from Jim Crane out there. One of our folks listening in says, Bill, where in the spectrum is it? In other words, what spectrum band is your approval, your license in?
Right. So our frequency is a little north of 450 megahertz, which is that might not mean much to a lot of folks, but in today's parlance, that's actually considered what they call low band spectrum. So that's kind of sandwiched in between the broadcasters, and it is below all the frequencies that cellular companies use for data. So cellular companies they have some low band, even as low as like 600 megahertz for data, which they consider their coverage layer, all the way up into the tens and tens of gigahertz, right? So they kind of are tending more towards the higher end now because that's where the availability is. So we're really in low band, which, as I mentioned before, gives us this killer RF propagation, which then allows us to make these ultra reliable links, which then just contributes even more so to the overall safety and robust nature of our network.
Well, let's talk about some of the key attributes of your network. And I think we have a slide here. While that slide is popping up, I also want to give a quick shout out to Ashok Kumar says, hello team, or hi team. So hello, Ashok. Thanks for dialing in. Appreciate you and for you taking the time to drop that note. So you just mentioned actually the 450 megahertz. I'm getting more questions, and this is really cool. I love when people jump in the chat. But John, we'll get to your question in a minute. Let's kind of roll through some of these key attributes. You mentioned kind of where in the band, the license spectrum that you have, and the criticality of that. The fact that it is aviation specific. Band, which is really amazing. Let's talk about some of these other things and roll through them. So you mentioned that your radio link is ultra reliable. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So what that means is we want to make sure what's the biggest problem you're going to face, right? If you're going to be flying in controlled airspace, you're going to want to know that, okay, I got this Aura C2 link. That's great. But is it going to be available at this point in time along this route that I'm flying?
Right.
I want to make sure it is, right? So that's what we do. We guarantee that that actually will happen.
Yep.
And we do that by, obviously the network build and obviously a lot of testing, but there's things we can do to the signal to make sure it will meet the link with the aircraft. And so there's a number of things how you handle modulation is one thing we do. So there's a number of tricks, if you will, not tricks, but just some of these are just more kind of best practices. Also, one big thing we do and what makes us very different is we have what we call a deterministic network, meaning that we know exactly at a specific point in space and time that we will make this network available to you. So unlike a network where you have a cell phone, where you run around town and you tell the network, you're at the grocery store, you're at the movie theater, you're at the baseball game. The network's telling you where you're going, right? Because you filed a flight plan, and network says if you're here at this point in time, you get spectrum availability, right? So it's a deterministic network. So the network drives it, not the user, the other way around, right? So that's a big factor to make sure if you behave like that, then we can guarantee that you'll have spectrum and you'll have access at that point in time. Does that make sense?
Okay, so it's almost like on demand, right? Like it's like so you file a flight plan with Aura essentially and say this is going to be my route, and then basically you validate like yes, you will have connectivity throughout the time. And we'll talk about safety features here in a second, because obviously this is really important if something happens along that route. But let's talk about privacy and security, right? As you think about public acceptance of these operations, especially when you're talking about beyond visual line of sight, you don't have a pilot on board. How do you maintain like the security of the link? I know this is something we're seeing right in across the pond in the Ukraine situation, right, where things are getting hacked, they're getting jammed, they're getting spoofed. Like how do you make sure this thing is secure?
Yeah, so we have a number of things we do. I can really kind of mention just a couple of them.
Yeah, you can't. Obviously, you're not going to give us your secret sauce here, but yeah.
So one is, inherently the nature of a private network is a big step forward towards security. You have to be on our network to have access to the network in the first place. And so a private network is a big thing. Tools we use on that private network, obviously there's lots of encryption. We do other things like even with the blockchain, there's a number of things that happen in the background there that not only add to security, but prevent things like spoofing.
Right.
And that's extremely important to us, because if you can, safety, really, like the FAA safety, we always say, is our North Star. And so if people can break into the network, then, and they were able to have, if there was an easy access network, they could take down UASs, right? They could cause them to crash. They could take control of them. There's all kinds of negative consequences. So security is really kind of, that is one of our top priorities in order to maintain that, North Star focus on safety.
Yeah, absolutely makes an abundant amount of sense. By the way, Bill, we've got John Loesch out there. Here's his question to you. How critical is the ONDAS or ONDAS networking technology to what you're doing?
Yeah, so ONDAS is actually, ONDAS has played a key role in what we're actually building in our network. So when we started the company, we actually partnered with ONDAS to build the radio gear that is actually now out on our network sites. So we have, it's right around 57 sites, mostly done. There's like one in Guam, and there's a couple places, Guam, like American Samoa, where there's still construction ongoing. But for the most part, we have continental United States covered, Hawaii covered, and Puerto Rico covered, and Alaska as well. And that was kind of version 1 of the network, and that was all done with ONDAS. And we did that all actually very quickly back in 2020. So kind of the first build was that first layer was all ONDAS, right? And so that's actually what's operating today.
Actually, I want to just back up for a second. For the uninitiated, what is Ondas? And I think slide 3 kind of gets into some of these company highlights and how you've built out the company, including with Ondas technology. So maybe we can put up slide 3, and then you could maybe tell us also what Ondas is all about.
There we go. Okay, so right, so that would be on the third part of the built part. So what we have right now, as I mentioned before, let's rewind for a moment. As I mentioned before, we said, we build this very cost effectively and build where customers have routes, right?
Yes,
Where
yes.
do they want to fly? That's where we build an hour. But
Right.
before we could even do that, we had to build a nationwide footprint per the requirements of the FCC to maintain and kind of operate within regulatory compliance the actual licenses themselves across the United States, right?
Right.
So step one was to kind of build this overall layer, right? I would call that while it's an operating network, it's really more focused on testing than anything else, right? So that's really kind of where the first generation of radios were, and that's where Ondas was, right?
Gotcha.
What we're doing now is we're moving towards, when we're working with customers, we're working towards enhancing the network, different kinds of gear, all throughout. So think of like the first side is like step 1 is a testing site. Step 2 is going to be a hardened site. It's going to have multiple antenna on. It's going to have a generator. It's going to have redundant fiber links, on and on, right? And so that's going to be the commercial version of the network, and that gets built where customers want to fly. So what that means is you have this kind of nationwide footprint, but then you're going to start to see routes being built with all this new gear. And so that's really kind of step 2, which is the step we're really we're embarking on now with our customers.
Awesome. And I'd be remiss not to mention, it was on the slide, but CJ, you don't need to put that back up. AURA stands for Advanced Ultra Reliable Aviation. I love that. So it is an acronym, and being a former military, acronyms are near and dear to my heart. So that's what AURA stands for, everybody. So you just learned it here. Ron Joseph has a really good question, Bill, because we've seen a lot, let's just call it big kerfuffles, right? That's a technical term, in the past year, really, about near band interference, whether it was kind of the 5G anticipated rollout last December with, T-Mobile and some of these other companies possibly interfering with life critical systems on crewed aircraft. And then, we've got the Legato situation with their terrestrial mobile satellite system and some near band interference claims that frankly were just validated by the National Academy of Sciences, Medicine, and I forget the third one. It's like 3 organizations in one. Just did a big report on this, at least for the DoD and kind of high resolution GPS receivers. So Ron's question is there any concern about operating so close to the 770 centimeter or the 420, 450 megahertz amateur radio band as a ham radio operator? There's, I guess, his handle. I would be somewhat concerned about RF splatter affecting navigation.
No, we're not. So first of all, we're in a very different band, right? So we're at 400, right, or 450. We're not up at these other bands that you were mentioning a moment ago. And no, there's not. If anything, we're seeing when we go out and actually do our RF measurements, we're seeing interference into our band as opposed to us causing interference out. One big thing to remember is the power levels that we're operating at are super low, right? So, and that's actually something you, believe it or not, need to do because 450 is so strong that you can go so far. I mean, the last gentleman who's a ham radio operator will know what you can do with just a handheld radio, right? You can go really far with the right weather conditions. So we actually tune the power very low. So the interference we see is actually kind of the opposite, right? So it's more into us than it is into them. So.
And yeah, so if it's into you and you're flying on that network, how do you kind of mitigate the concerns of maybe someone encroaching into what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of tricks. There's lots of practices you can do on the radio to stop that, right? Some folks are actually, camping in the band because that hasn't been used for a long time. We're making use of a band that It wasn't exactly robustly used 5, 10 years ago, so people are there doing it. Some people have temporary authority to actually work in our band, believe it or not. So all those things are actually pretty easy to address. It just takes time and work on our side to kind of make sure that if there's any kind of direct interference, we can clean that up. And that usually means they have to change the way they transmit into our band, or they just have to, they can either stop transmitting or they just have to get different gear. There's lots of different things you can do. But we're a very good neighbor because there isn't a ton around where we are right now. In fact, there's a band that's somewhat similar to ours, a little below ours, that's kind of twice the size of ours, but it's more used for like paging and some two-way radio type activities as well. So we don't have any. We're a good neighbor, and I think in a very good RF neighborhood, if you will.
No, that's excellent. And I'm just laughing because I don't remember the last time I saw a pager. So I have very few concerns about, I'm like flashback to the 1980s, everybody.
They're still out there, believe it or not.
Well, I guess there may be some people still using those, but anyway, probably a great segue, Bill, to talk about something you mentioned a little earlier, the fact that you're already out there, kind of using your private network in a lots of different contexts. I know you're working with NASA and the FAA. Can you and others? Can you walk us through maybe some of these projects and basically what you're finding as you roll this out?
Yeah, no, that's great. So we're doing so with the FAA, we've got a CRADA, which is a Cooperative Research and Development Agreement, and that's around voice. Right, and that's around how do you set, because as we talked about earlier, voice is an integral part of C2, so you can communicate to air traffic control and situational awareness for other aircraft in controlled airspace. So CRADA is very important. FAA and AURA are doing a lot of good work on this, and it's really designed to not only work around kind of let's sharpen the regulatory environment here, but let's also measure the performance of both what AURA is doing as well as what the FAA is doing. Right, so there's a latency budget. I mean, in other words, the amount of time it takes to go from point A to point B. And part of that's what you're allowed to have, and part of that was what the FAA is allowed to have. So they're redoing that analysis as well while they're doing the work with AURA. So that's really a voice-focused CRADA, 4 years. We're not even 1 year into it right now. But important work. It's going very well. FAA has been a great partner on. The other piece is NASA, where we have 2 Space Act agreements. And that's working on really, the best way to put it is kind of the UAM, urban air mobility, or advanced air mobility, AAM, kind of that ecosystem, how that comes together, what has to happen, who can do what. There's a lot of ecosystem partners also involved in that. And so some of these people are folks that are or will be our customers. So we're kind of interacting with in some cases on a private sense, in some cases in a public sense. But it's a neat thing to be a part of because it just showcases the value of AURA, what we're bringing, and the importance of C2, because NASA understands you got to have a C2 link to fly BVLOS and fly these AAM missions. So so the 2 Space Act agreements we have with NASA.
Yeah. So that's great stuff to be working with the FAA and NASA both. But you were also, so you've also been working with the standards bodies beyond that, right. Let's just say additional to the actual Space Act agreements, CRADAs, and R&D you're doing in real time. You guys were actually part of the BVLOS ARC, right? The Aviation Rulemaking Committee.
We were. Yeah, we were. We were part of the ARC as it relates to kind of third-party systems, which is essentially what AURA would be, right? Providing C2. Yeah. So part of the ARC, the ARC, great work, good first step, right? A lot of it was focused more on the SUAS or the smaller aircraft, but that really, I think, lays the foundation for how they're going to treat, or it's a good starting point, right, for how you treat larger UAS in controlled airspace. So yeah, we were part of that. We're part of, we're actually in the RTCA right now, essentially working on our radio to standardize our radio from the 450 band. And that's an important step, right? So people down the road, when this is done, it'll be a lot easier for them to integrate that into their aircraft and to build their safety case around AURA. That's the key. Everything we do, right? Like everything we do, FAA compliance, right? FAA safety first, right? So We work with them. We're not trying to change anything. The rules are already out there. We're following them. Straight as simple as that, right?
Yeah.
We're also on some of the standards makings committees. So SC228 is one that we're co-chairing that also includes command and control as one of the subcommittees. So we have an active voice, but the way the RTCA works is it's a voice within a community, right? So,
Right.
it's not like you're sitting there and kind of saying, well, here's what needs to happen and it's going to happen. No, I mean,
Right.
it's a lot of other companies. It's very collaborative, a lot of peer review, if you will. It's probably the best way to phrase it. So
Yep.
we're really part of the community, and that's working well for us so far.
Yeah, and I know probably a lot of folks out there have heard this term before, the MOPS, the minimum operation performance standards, and that's kind of the RTCA work that you and your folks are doing, right, for the C2
Right.
links for avionics. So that's really
Yep.
huge. I mean, we're literally building it as we're flying it, right? Because let's face it, Bill, like not a lot of these kind of higher level, larger drone operations are happening right now because we're kind of in that, as the FAA says, crawl, walk, run. I'd say we're kind of in that crawling phase, right? Like building out the standards. What does this thing look like? Let's test it through CRADAs, through Space Act agreements, make sure we're good to go. But in the meantime, you guys are moving out. So let's talk about those 57 sites that you already have across the country. And you said Guam and Hawaii and some of these other locations. Can you just quickly, I mean, you obviously don't go through all 57, but just kind of give us an idea of where you're thinking, because you said this is a deterministic network. People can basically tell you like, hey, here's where we're going to be. Just from what you're seeing, I assume that is what's driving some of the locations. So, what are some of the, let's say, call it the hot spots, no pun intended. What are some of the hot spots where you're building there you go, where you're building your network out right now?
Okay, so two things, right? So the straight answer to that is I can't tell you, because that would be telling you where the customers are building and where they want to fly, and that would be violating. That would be a big no-no, and the legal department would be all over me for that. So
Gotcha.
But to draw a contrast to the 57 sites we have, right? The 57 sites we have today
Yeah.
are built around the actual licenses we have that we
Okay.
have from the FCC that we did back in 20 from a kind of, you had to build all the licenses to essentially keep the licenses, right?
Okay,
There's what we
gotcha.
call a build deadline, right, at the FCC.
Okay.
So we had to do all that. So that doesn't mean people are flying on those 57 sites, right? Those 57 sites are first and foremost manned aviation sites, right?
Oh.
This was manned aviation that then we have the authority to also do unmanned aviation, right? So or uncrewed
Yes.
aviation, right? So it started crewed and it moved to uncrewed, but you still do both, right?
Yes.
So crewed aviation actually is also part of our business plan, right? Because when you're
Okay.
building aviation, a hardcore aviation robust network like this, you can use it for a lot of things. So you can use it for crewed and you can use it for uncrewed, right? So we're going to use it for both. So that said, the 57 are, I would say, still more kind of, think of them as more kind of an early stage like testing that we like test. We do a lot of work on the manned with those actually.
Okay.
And so it's the ones we're going to build for the customers that are very specific, that are going to be much more, I'd say, focused on unmanned or uncrewed, but there is still some crewed in there as well.
Okay. So could you, before we get to your future commercial network build out, kind of what that kind of generically is going to look like without getting into specific clients or where they're going to be. So of these 57, could you give me maybe examples of like 3 locations where you've already built out, like where you have your sites?
Sure. They're almost in every state.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that makes sense.
They're
Okay.
all over. They're all over. So you actually have, depending upon your altitude, you actually have the 57 alone actually create a nationwide footprint.
Holy
Which
snipes.
is
Okay.
great, right? When you think about
Yeah.
like a carrier that might have 60,000 sites, and granted they also have capacity there.
Yeah.
They have 100 plus customers, but they'll have 60,000 sites in a network, and we have 57. So yeah, I mean, we've got them. California is another example where we actually put a site in the mountains, a little to the east, or in the east side of the bay, and with that one site, the coverage is just it's very robust. Let's put it that way.
All
So
right.
all the airports, like what you see right there,
Yeah.
you have a number of Class B airports right there. So because 450 has such great RF coverage that you don't need to put multiple sites in there other than from a capacity point of view down the road, right? So I just think of us in pretty much in every state, and in Puerto Rico, and we're also in Hawaii. Got a number. I mean, Alaska's so large that we actually have I think we have 6 sites now in Alaska, 5 or 6. I've lost track.
Wow.
But that is because it's so large that you really actually need to have a number of sites just to provide coverage.
Well, and when you think about the future of aviation, Alaska is really kind of a key place for beyond visual line of sight because it is so large. It's, there's large areas of unpopulated, right, terrain
Yeah.
where and pipelines that need inspecting and all, things that need to be delivered. So, I mean,
Right.
that's really, when you think about it, an ideal location. But we have one more slide that I want to pop up here about your future commercial network and kind of generically how you kind of plan to build that out. So if we could pull that up, and if you could walk us through this, because I think it really gives the overarching, as we kind of get closer to the end of our time together, the overarching view of what this thing is going to look like.
Right. So this slide that you just put up really gives kind of the big picture view of how we're talking through, and you can see this. It looks like the communications tower there, kind of in the middle left.
Yeah.
How we talk to both the UAS, and then how the UAS through a voice link would talk over to air traffic control on the right hand side. We actually have, from that site, we actually have 3 different types of sites that we plan to use. And that really depends on the customer's coverage needs and capacity. So we can kind of grow over time as the customer's utilization of the route grows over time. Think of it that way as well.
Yeah.
You can see on the bottom that we actually do integrate with the cloud in a private way. And these links that you see in green on kind of in the dark area, kind of the bottom half of the slide, those are all private. So again, doesn't touch the internet. This is our own fiber, that kind of thing, right? And on the far left-hand side, you see the Flight Operations Center, where you'd have a pilot and some hardware that would connect them directly into our network in a redundant way, and with some of our cloud partners. So this is really kind of I'd say the manifestation of what this will look like. It'll look very similar for different use cases. So if you think about a use case for urban air mobility versus air cargo versus linear inspection versus some kind of urgent delivery type things, it'll all look very similar, right? So there's a lot of scale that you get out of this network design as well.
Okay, so that's great. And you just mentioned use cases. So the question I want to ask, which I'm sure is on people's minds that are out there. So, the smaller companies, the mom and pop folks, right? Can they tap into this, or is this really for kind of larger companies, or is it all of the above?
Yeah, it's really all of the above. I mean, we tend to run this network. Our plan is to run this network on an open access basis, right? So there's 2 ways that can manifest, right? Someone can come to us and say, hey, I want to build a site from here to there, kind of point A to point B, right?
Right.
And then as a part of that, once that site's built, someone else can say, hey, I also want to fly that same route. So, that's fine too. Everyone can use that, right? It's not closed off, right?
Okay.
Now, if a mom and pop comes up and says, well, hey, I want to do something small and I can't afford a site and all that kind of thing, and there's no other sites we can provide capacity for them, then we have much smaller and much more cost-effective, lower utilization options available as well for people to use. I don't think that's where the market's going to start. I think the market's going to start with, use cases that are larger scale, have higher utilization, because the economics just make more sense in that case. But over time, sure, people can connect in. They'll be able to connect in through what you saw on the slide before, right? Where they're actually connecting in through fiber. There will be other ways for smaller folks to connect in on just as a secure basis, right? We've kind of designed the network for kind of all takers.
Okay, well, that's amazing. And so what kind of are the next steps? Like, what do you see on the horizon? I mean, we're in Q4, which I can't believe, of 2022 already. We're almost ready to close out this year. We're rolling into 2023. What's on the horizon for Aura, Bill?
Yeah. So what's coming up right now is we've got a bunch of pillars of what we're working on here, right? So we're still, like we mentioned, going through our TCA. So we still have a large technology development effort underway to actually build all those different pieces you saw on that previous network slide.
Yes.
To build all those and to integrate all those, that's still ongoing and a big piece. A lot of progress is made, and we're testing a lot of aspects right now. We've got a lot of prototype versions of this, but we're going through that process to get to the commercial endpoint, right? And going through the standards process to support that. So that's one piece. The other piece, and this is a big one, right, is testing with potential customers. You know, we're testing with a number of leaders in different use cases, and you know, helping them work on their safety cases, helping them understand what we're doing so that they know when they're ready to go commercial, which isn't tomorrow, it's still down the road a bit.
Sure.
But when they're ready to go commercial, that Aura is going to be there. That Aura is going to be there in a way that enables them, in a way that does that safely, in a way that does that with FAA regulatory compliance top of mind. So it really gives them a good edge, and we've got to provide comfort and surety for these folks, right? Because this is, at the end of the day, this is all about safety, right? So that's what we're doing. I think those two big things are that's really what's on the horizon for Aura here.
And I think from a previous conversation, Bill, you mentioned like you work with folks like the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Did I recall that correctly? Yes. So I'm a super fan of what the Choctaw Nation is doing out there in Oklahoma. Came out on the list. The state of Oklahoma is the #1 drone friendly state. So good place for you to be, obviously. And doing things, I think in Maryland, you did some things this summer where you were doing some remote operations out there, and also in Ohio. So, so great things on the horizon. By the way, Olga Aristival is out there saying excellent image. So Olga is a regular in our clubhouse and also on this show. So thanks for dialing in again, Olga. Really appreciate you. So this is great stuff, Bill. We are about 2 minutes out to the end of our time. So I want to make sure that before we close that we did not miss anything you want to relay to everybody out there, and you know, whether or not you have any closing comments for the group.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you having me. I mean, the biggest thing, I think we covered all the main points. I think that this is just we are a huge believer in this industry, obviously, from what our role is. We believe we're one of the enablers to really help all kinds of cross sections of use cases to actually manifest. We believe that this is truly the end of the quiet skies. We think we're going to start seeing a lot of UAS. In our mind, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the good news about what we're doing is we're working in a number of different use case segments. So, you know, if the timing is slowed down for one versus another, that's okay. Because we're, like I said, we're establishing a pretty broad reach, which actually in one sense then benefits everybody, right? Because like I said earlier before, the networks looks somewhat the same for every single use case and every single customer. So what one customer does down the road benefits another, right? So it's just an exciting time, and we've got a lot of good announcements about to happen here, and we're just really very pleased to be part of this industry.
Well, we're going to be keeping a close eye on what you're doing, Bill. You've made me a fan, and everybody, if you haven't visited Aura's website, I know we can drop that in the chat. Make sure you check that out because there's some really great. I know Olga just talked about excellent images, other excellent images on that website, including where some of these locations are right now, and also I believe. You know, you're seeking partners, right, Bill? So you're welcoming the opportunity for flight testing and things like that over your FCC approved frequencies in the NAS. So if we could drop that link on how folks can reach the inquiries division of Aura, if they're interested in partnering with Aura on these things going forward, that would be amazing. So thank you for doing that. All right, well, we are at our time together, Bill. Any final comments, any last words?
Thank you for having me. See you out
absolutely.
there.
Yeah, we'll see you out there in the skies. So thank you, everybody. We are out here.